In this video, I want to discuss some of the features of the spinal cord and the makeup of a spinal nerve. And in this model, we see this happening within a cervical vertebra. Now, I can tell that this is a cervical vertebra. There's some features that are very obvious. Here we can see the bifid spinous process of the cervical vertebra. The major feature of a cervical vertebra that we talked about when we did the vertebral column was that there's a transverse foramen. In this model, though, we don't see the transverse foramen very well because it has the vertebral artery and a branch of a vertebral vein within that transverse foramen. So it's very hard to tell that the transverse foramen is here. If we were to remove these structures, it would be very obvious. So here we have a cervical vertebra, and within the vertebral canal we can see the spinal cord and the things that make up the spinal cord. I'll talk about those in just a moment. But while we're here, I want to point out a couple of other features that are on this model that relate to the vertebral column. Along the posterior aspect of the body of this vertebra, we see the posterior longitudinal ligament. Remember, the posterior longitudinal ligament is within the vertebral canal on the posterior aspect of the vertebral body. And here we see the lamina of the vertebra, and we can see on this model what represents the ligamentum flavum. Remember, ligamentum flavum connects from lamina to lamina of adjacent vertebra. Now I want to focus on the nervous system structures related to this model. We can see the spinal cord within the vertebral canal, but we can also on this model see the different layers of the meninges. The outermost layer of the meninges is the dura mater, and here we see the dura mater. Dura mater literally means tough mother. And directly beneath the dura mater we see another layer known as the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater. And then there's a space called the subarachnoid space. We can see that over here on the lateral aspects a little bit better. The dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then a large space called the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now the third layer of the meninges is on the surface of the spinal cord itself, and that is known as the pia mater. So on this model, the white basically represents our pia mater, and the pia mater is adhered to the surface of the spinal cord. There are several places along the spinal cord where the pia mater forms little ligaments that will reach out and span the gap and pierce through the arachnoid mater to the dura mater. We can see one here, we can see another one down in here. Those are called denticulate ligaments. So there's a denticulate ligament here, and a denticulate ligament here, and there's one on the other side in here. They span that subarachnoid space to reach through the arachnoid mater into the dura mater to help anchor the spinal cord. Now, if we look at the cross-section of the spinal cord on this model, we can see the gray matter forms sort of an H in the interior of the spinal cord, and then it is surrounded by the white matter, the fiber tracts of the spinal cord. Different regions of the cord are going to look a little bit different. In the cervical region, the gray matter has a dorsal horn and it has a larger ventral horn. So a dorsal horn and a ventral horn. And then it has gray matter crossing the midline. And on this model we can see right in the middle a canal. This is the central canal of the spinal cord. We also see, if we look carefully, white matter crossing the midline right here. This is called the ventral white commissure. The ventral white commissure. So again, in the spinal cord, the gray matter is not along the surface, but rather forms this somewhat of an H pattern in the interior of the spinal cord. Now the spinal cord has many surface features that we should discuss. On the ventral surface of the spinal cord, there's a deep fissure. This fissure is known as the ventral median fissure. A fissure is much deeper than a sulcus. So here we see the ventral median fissure. In the back we have a slight indentation at midline. This is called the dorsal median sulcus. The dorsal median sulcus. Now if we follow along the back of the cord and work our way laterally, we can see where the dorsal horn of the gray matter appears to reach the surface of the spinal cord. There's a slight indentation there. That is known as the dorsolateral sulcus. That's one word, dorsolateral sulcus. Not quite halfway between the dorsal median sulcus and the dorsolateral sulcus, we see another slight indentation here and here. This is known as the dorsal intermediate sulcus. There is on this cord a ventrolateral sulcus. It is not well depicted on this cord. There should be a slight indentation right about here, the ventrolateral sulcus. But we can tell where the ventrolateral sulcus and dorsolateral sulcus are on the cord for another reason. At the dorsolateral sulcus, we will see the dorsal rootlets of the spinal nerve entering into the spinal cord. So here we have dorsal rootlets, which came from the dorsal root of our spinal nerve, and anteriorly we have the ventral rootlets, which came out of the spinal cord from the ventral horn through the ventrolateral sulcus to join the ventral root of our spinal nerve. So here we have dorsal rootlets going to form our dorsal root, and ventral rootlets going to form our ventral root. If we follow on this other side, we can see that we're going to work our way away from the spinal cord. The dorsal roots, or rootlets, and the ventral rootlets will form the dorsal root and the ventral root. The nerve cell bodies for the motor neurons found in the ventral root are located within the ventral horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord. However, the nerve cell bodies for the sensory neurons forming these dorsal rootlets are located laterally in the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal nerve. The dorsal root ganglion. So at this point we do not have spinal nerve. We have dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion. We have the ventral root. It is only at this point here where we have our spinal nerve. Notice that spinal nerve is passing over the pedicle of this vertebra to leave at the intervertebral foramen. That spinal nerve does not run for very long before it will divide into a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. So a quick recap: the spinal nerve is made up of dorsal roots and ventral roots, which were made of dorsal rootlets and ventral rootlets. That spinal nerve runs for a very short distance before it divides into dorsal rami and ventral rami. Now I want to talk about part of this model that represents a portion of our sympathetic nervous system. As we leave through the spinal nerve, coming from the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve in the sympathetic system, we're going to see a white ramus and a gray ramus. And white ramus will send information into the sympathetic chain ganglia, also known as the paravertebral ganglia. However, on this model, we only see one ramus. The question would be, is this a white ramus or a gray ramus? Well, remember, in the sympathetic nervous system, the white rami are only found in the thoraco and upper lumbar portion of the vertebral column. This happens to be a cervical vertebra. So what we have here is a gray ramus. The information traveled through the paravertebral ganglion up the chain into this ganglion, which happens to be a cervical ganglion. It's either the inferior cervical ganglion or the middle cervical ganglion. It cannot be the superior because we see more chain coming this way. We know in the cervical region we do not have a white ramus communicans. The information comes through the chain, but we have the gray ramus communicans going back to join the spinal nerve. So in this region, because we know it's cervical and because we only see one ramus, we know this must be a gray ramus communicans, part of the sympathetic nervous system, and we know this must be one of the sympathetic cervical ganglia.